Now that the modeling is completed, we can do our lighting and generate our renders. I'll start by introducing a spotlight. Holding down the space bar, we'll go to Create, Lights, I'll click on Spotlight. Very often if you're in 6 or 5 in your viewport, you won't be able to see the light icon. But if you hit 4 on the keyboard, you'll see the wireframe cone shape in your comp. I'll hit W on the keyboard and I'll drag this up above the model to start. Going to the top view, I'm going to determine where I might want to make these renders from. I'm thinking if I put the light here and point it towards the comp, that might be a good place to start off. I'll hit T on the keyboard and I want to snap the target area to a general center of my comp. Holding down X on the keyboard, I can click on now what is a circle with the left mouse and drag and snap it to any point on the grid. Once I have a general area I want, I need to also go to my front or side view, and in that view I want to move it down to the base of the composition. Once again, holding X and clicking on the target area, I'll drag and snap it to the XZ axes. I've returned to my perspective view, and with the light selected, I'm going to go to the light attributes. Now, because we're using Arnold, we kind of do a general setup. So in the attributes of the light, I'll start by changing the intensity to roughly 30, and I'll make the penumbra angle 10, and then I'm going to open the Arnold tab, and in the Arnold tab I'm going to change the exposure to 3.5. We're going to keep the resolution low because the final renders are going to be in a PDF that needs to be emailed, but I'll change the samples to 2. That'll give me a pretty decent render, even though we're going to be rendering about 100 dpi or 72 dpi. Now that the light's generally set up, I'll hit 6 on the keyboard and I'm going to go to Arnold and I'll click on Open Arnold Render View. And if I click on the red triangle in the right hand corner of the render view, it turns into a square and it gives me an idea of what I have thus far. And you'll see that the word render appears in the lower right hand corner until the render is complete. Then you'll just see a numerical arrangement there. Now I want to be able to edit this. I'm going to make sure that my outliner is on my shelf, because if that's there, then I can access the light without moving my perspective or view about and changing a composition that I might happen to like. So I'll go to the dock, hold down Command Shift, going to Window and clicking on Outliner. And if you have more than one, you can right click on any of these tools and you can choose Delete. That's going to allow me to select my light and make the changes to it. So if I were to click on Outliner now and then click on the spotlight, there are my attributes. And I can change pretty much everything I need with the exception of the angle of this. So if I wanted to, I could increase the cone size. I could increase the penumbra angle, which would soften this edge even more. You can go beyond the 10, but I'm going to leave that the way it is. And I think I might change the intensity a bit as well. So I'll bring the intensity up. I'll just drag this, and maybe I'll start with maybe about 40. I want to change the angle of this because I want the shadows perhaps going in the opposite direction. But I don't want to change this view. I like the composition like this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another tool to my shelf that will allow me to return to this pose. I'm going to click on the viewport and I'm going to go to View inside the viewport, down to Bookmarks, and then to Edit Bookmarks. And I can now name this Pose 1, hitting the Return key. It sets the pose, and then I'll click on Add to Shelf. And you'll see an M now on your dock. If I had changed my perspective view in any capacity, I could simply click on that M that appears on the shelf now because of the pose we assigned there, and it returns it to that composition setting. Now I'm going to change the lights on this as well. So I'll select the light, and going back into the light attributes, I can now start to refine my shadows, the density, and perhaps the cone angle, as well as the penumbra angle. I'll start by going down to Arnold, and I'm going to reduce the density of that shadow. Right now it's very opaque. I'm not seeing my plane texture in my viewport. So I'll go over to the shadow density under Arnold and I'll start to drag that to the left. And as I do and let go, you'll see you start to get some translucence. I've dropped the density down to maybe 0.6. This stuff is very subjective at this point. Always remembering to hit return if I change any of the numerical values in Maya. Leaving a blinking cursor will kind of cripple the application from moving forward with the change you made. Now I don't want the shadows to be this harsh. It's an interior setup, so I'd like the shadows themselves to be softness. So I'll scroll down. Under samples you'll see radius, and as you drag that to the right you'll see that your shadow will soften. I might make it 2.5. Again, this is very subjective, bearing in mind that the higher this number and the sample, the longer it's going to take to render. So I can see now it's taking a bit longer. And I can see that there's that word render in the lower left-hand corner, and it's updating for me. Now, this is pretty quick on my computer, but there's a way of processing this and sampling it before rendering a whole picture. If we look at the top of the Arnold render view, you'll see a little blue square on your dock. And that will allow me, when I click on it, to sample an area that I think could be troublesome. That might be, I'm going to zoom in on the comp a bit, just to make this a little bit perhaps easier to see. Very often when you've got the shadows, especially with that radius change, there might be issues with the quality of the render. So I'm just kind of moving in here so we can see this. Now I probably will bring the density up a bit more so you can see how this works. There's always a chance that where the radius has been changed that it can be very grainy. And with that tool I can click and drag a selection of an area and it will render specifically to that. And you'll see it happen quite quickly. Now with this process I can click on the center, drag to another area. I can increase the scale of it as well and move it around to preview those areas before I spend a lot of time rendering it. And you can see now that's rendered that. Now what I also can do is, you'll notice that in the lower right hand corner of the Arnold render view is a little camera. And when I click on it, you can see that it's deposited that selection on the dock. So if I wanted to, I could move it again, increase the size of it, and once it's finished rendering, I can add that as well. And it'll show me the quality of that render. You can see that as I go back and forth, the area that is being refined in either of these. And you can right click and you can choose delete snapshot. Now I don't think you'll need this, but it's good to know. Once you've set your light samples to 2, let's just go ahead and we'll review that again. So if I'm in my light, if you recall, we changed samples to 2, and then we played a little bit with the radius, giving us our softness of shadow. It's one other thing we need to do in the actual Arnold render settings before we can proceed with our finished renders. I'm going to go to the little Hollywood clapboard with the blue gear in it, and we'll click on that. And in here, we're going to set the dimensions, the resolution, and then the quality of the camera. I'm going to click on the Common tab. We do not have to change the file output because in the render window, we'll be able to do that. It'll by default save it as a JPEG, and that's what we want at this point. This window is really pretty much reserved for animation sequences. We'll address that when we do the 360 animation of our composition as well. So I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to go to the presets for the image. I want to make sure it's HD 540. And I'm going to change my res to 100. Depending on where you do these renders, probably the best place is in the lab. We need to consider that the higher the resolution, the more time consuming it is as well. When it comes to rendering perhaps your final piece, if you need it for your portfolio down the line, this resolution would be bumped up so you can get print quality. 300 dpi would be sufficient. Now I'm going to click on the Arnold renderer and I'm going to change the camera AA to 4. So with the camera AA set to 4 and our light sample set for 2, we should get adequate renders for this project and for maybe every other project you might do in class. Now I'll retrieve the Arnold render view. I'll put my render view on so I can see it. And if I chose to now, I could go to my dock, and if I click on the M, it returns it to the view that I had saved. Now that's something else that is subjective. You don't have to necessarily do that. It's just good to know, may help you save a lot of time. Perhaps I'd like this light to be a little higher above the whole composition. I'll start to drag it over the comp. And if I wanted to now, I could go into my orthographics and bring the light out so that I see the entire model. Now, be careful not to render out the corners of your plain image, that tablecloth. All right, so you may find yourself having to go in and tweak in your light attributes that cone angle. Maybe it has to be reduced, maybe it has to be increased. Once I see that the render is completed in the lower right hand corner of my Arnold render view, I can go to File, Save Image, and I would give it a name. And on my desktop or in my source images of my project, I'd save it, and that would be a JPEG. And you'll need at least 4 of these using different poses.